Hello, this is John from caveofprogramming.com. In this tutorial, we're going to hook up URLs to Webflows basically, so that we can go to a special URL and that will invoke our Webflow. And our Webflow won't work yet because we'll have some further work to do to tell our Webflow that we want to use Apache tiles, but we'll at least get to the point where we can get an error message about a missing JSP in this tutorial, so that we know we're on the right track. So I've got my flow registry at the moment, but what actually executes that registry, the flows in the registry? The flow registry says where the web flows are located, and we've only got one at the moment, but we need something to actually execute that web flow, and what does that is the flow executor. So I'm going to go to my flow tab here, and I'm going to right click the beans root element and go to insert flow executor element, and I'll give that the ID of flow executor, and I'll set the flow registry here to flow registry. So that's the ID of the flow registry. And if we look at source now, we'll see that we've added this bit here. So we've got a flow executor which has the ID of the flow registry. So this executes web flows, but what actually invokes the flow executor? We need the equivalent of a controller that can actually find the executor and run it instead of just going to a view resolver. So what does that is a bean called flow handler adapter. So I'm going to go to the beans tab here, and let's click new bean, and I'll give it the ID flow handler adapter. Flow handler adapter. And for the class, I'll browse and I'll search for, well, actually it's here, flow handler adapter. Now there are two here, and the difference is one has portlet in the package name and the other servlet. We need the servlet one. If you get errors about portlets, then you've added the wrong one. So we'll add this flow handler adapter from this servlet package here. Click OK and click Finish. Now this flow handler adapter is going to need a handle on the executor, because its job is to basically find the flow executor and run it, as I understand it. So I'm going to go back to beans here and right click flow handler adapter and go to insert property element, and this property is called flow executor, funnily enough, and we need to give it the ID of the flow executor. So I'll set ref here to flow executor because it refers to another bean, flow executor. I'll save that, and now we've got the flow handler adapter bean that's set up with a handle on the flow executor. So we've got something now that can execute a flow, and we've got something that can find the executor and tell it to execute a flow, kind of like a controller. But what we haven't got is we haven't got something that can look at a URL and say, yeah, this is a flow URL, and we need to handle it with the flow handler adapter. And what does that is a thing called flow handler mapping. So I'm going to go back to the beans tab again, new bean, and I'll give it an ID flow handler mapping, and for the class it's going to be flow handler, let's click browse, flow handler mapping, and I'll click OK, and there's only one of those. Now the flow handler mapping has to recognize URLs that come in and recognize them as special flow URLs. And how can it know that we've got a flow URL? Well, if we look at source here, if we look at the source tab, we've got this flow registry, and that registers one flow at the moment, and that's got an ID of message, and that is going to be the URL that the user goes to invoke the flow. So flow handler mapping is going to need a handle to the registry in order to be able to access that information and to know that that URL means run a flow. So I'll go to beans and right click flow handler mapping and go to beans, insert property element, and the property is called flow registry. and we'll set it to the ID flow registry, which is the ID of our flow registry. I'll save that. We've got one more property to set on flow handler mapping here, which has to do with prioritizing the flow handler mapping in such a way that it can look at URLs before anything else checks them. So we need to right click that, go to Beans, insert property element, and I'm going to set a property called order to the value 0, or you could add -1. Both seem to work. So if we look at source now, we've added quite a few things here. Let's just format this. So the flow handler mapping is going to examine our URLs. It's prioritized so that it handles them before anything else. It gets a chance to check them early on in the chain, as I understand it. And it has a handle to the flow registry so that it knows which URLs should invoke Webflows. Then we've got flow handler adapter, whose job it is to actually execute the Webflow. So this is actually going to run the Webflow. And we've got flow executor here. That's actually going to run the executor, which runs the Webflow. So this flow handler adapter, as I understand it, is like a controller, except that instead of going to a view resolver, it's going to go to our flow executor. And flow executor will actually run the Webflow, and it uses this flow registry which says where our flows are located. Well, that's just about as straight as I can keep all this in my head. There's 4 different things here, and we need all of them for this to work. And if you get completely lost and you don't want to type this in yourself, you could just copy and paste this really and change it slightly if you have to. Now we need to add a security exception for the URL /message. We said that the ID of this flow location is message, and that's going to also be the URL that we go to invoke this flow. So I'm going to go to source and config and my security context file. Let's copy a permit all rule here in the security section. And if you haven't set up security, then you won't need to do this, but you should set up security. And we'll go to /message and say that that is permit all. Now let's save that and let's run the project. And with a bit of luck, we'll actually try to run the flow, and it won't actually work because we haven't hooked up Apache tiles yet, and we're using Apache tiles in this program. But at least it will try to run a JSP file, which we haven't created, but we'll see a suitable error message. So I'm going to go to /message, the ID that I specified in the flow registry, and we see that /spring webinf flows start JSP is not present. Well, you could create that file if you want, but I'm going to go on to a second step in the next tutorial of hooking this up to Apache tiles. The reason it's going to start JSP here is because if we look at the flow file that we created under flows in webinf, contact-flow, we've got this view state called start, which by default will go to a file. It will display a file called start.jsp, and that's why we've got the particular error that we've got somewhere in here. Well, it's easier to see it on the actual page itself. So try to run your application and you should see an error like this, and if you don't, you probably missed something out from the configuration here, and it is very, very easy to miss something out. But once you've got an error, you can then go on and tell Webflow to use Apache tiles, because we're using that at the moment in our application, and I want to continue to use it rather than just displaying individual JSPs via Webflow. So we'll tackle that next time, and until then, happy coding.